Hi, folks. Welcome to Working Together, 10 years on. It's going to be an hour-long webinar featuring the three co-editors of the Working Together book. This year is the 10-year anniversary of the Purple Book, or by its full title, Working Together, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mental Health and Wellbeing Principles and Practice. We are therefore celebrating its momentous impact on this anniversary. We'll be having a yarn about the process of writing, editing and publishing, and discussing some of the issues explored in the text. This event is being recorded and we will share the recording and the PowerPoint slides later with everyone who registered. Cameras and audio for all attendees are automatically turned off. There will be an opportunity for questions to be answered by the panel at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen from now onwards. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. However, please keep in mind that we are limited in time and that some questions have been submitted before the session. Therefore, we may not get a chance to address them all. Right now, I'll read the acknowledgement of the country. We acknowledge that we are situated on Noongar land, that Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of this land and continue to practice their values, language, beliefs and knowledge. We recognise that people are joining us remotely from many different countries, clan groups across Australia, and we therefore pay our respects to the cultural custodians of these lands. We also acknowledge our allies and supporters who walk with us towards social justice. So, our panel today, we are lucky to have all three editors of the Working Together book here with us today. Three wonderful ladies. I'll be introducing each of them shortly, but first I'll introduce myself. My name's Michael Mitchell. I'm a Yamatji man from Yamal, up in Port Edwin, Pilbara country. It's my father's side, the Mitchells, and Mulgana, which is my mother's side, the Belottis. And my country extends from the Pilbara to Shark Bay here in WA. I started my working life as with an electrical apprenticeship and then went on to play footy with Claremont and Richmond. And then I began my career in Indigenous health and wellbeing while working with Aboriginal youth in Carnarvon, where I developed a training program for youth. And for several years, I managed and coordinated Aboriginal community controlled organisations, the CDP, the AMS, and then to the mental health program. I then earned a bachelor's degree in Indigenous health, specialising in mental health from Curtin University. Thanks to Pat here. Pat was the director. For 15 years, I was the service manager of Wangan Mental Health Service with WA Health. Currently, I'm on several research projects with these wonderful people in this room. I seem to be spending a lot of time with you, Mum. And I'm also on the AFL's Mental Health Committee and other committees and organisations around the place, all to do with health, social, emotional wellbeing and mental health. Now, our panel today, it is my great pleasure to introduce three good friends. And I'm a little bit taller than too, which is
he's very happy.
Yeah, but anyway, first time I'll be the tall person. Professor Pat Dudgeon is a Bardi woman from the Kimberley in Western Australia and is Australia's first Indigenous psychologist. She's a research fellow of Indigenous Studies, chief investigator at Timwa is Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing, and director of SABASIS, which is Centre for Best Practice Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention, both here at the School of Indigenous Studies at UWA. Pat is a board member of AIPA, the Australian Indigenous Australian Psychologists Association, and of Gaia Dewey. She's received many awards over the years, but one close to her heart is the Deadly Award for Health in 2013. And she received an Order of Australia just last year. Our other panel member on Pat's immediate right is the wonderful Professor Helen Milroy, is a Papu woman whose homelands are in the Pilbara region of WA, a neighbour of ours from up north. She is Australia's first Indigenous doctor and child psychiatrist. Helen is the Stan Perrin Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Perth Children's Hospital and here at UWA, and Honorary Research Fellow at Telethon Kids Institute. She's also the chair of Gaia Dewey Proud Spirit and a board member of Beyond Blue. In 2019, Helen was appointed the AFL's first Indigenous Commissioner. She was also formerly a commissioner with the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse and with the National Mental Health Commission. Helen has received many awards, including being named the West Australian Australian of the Year for 2021. Last but certainly not least, Helen is a fantastic artist and a published author and illustrator of children's books. She has been shortlisted for several children's literature awards, and I might just add, she does a lot of stuff in her own time period. Our final panel member is Professor Ros Walker. Ros has been involved in research, evaluation and education with Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal controlled organisations for over 35 years. She is a director at the Coolamon Research and Advocacy Centre, deputy director at the Nyira Institute for Change, and a professor and senior principal research fellow at Murdoch University. She is also a principal research fellow here at Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing. Ros co-led the development of the evaluation framework for the ATSIPET in partnership with Pat, and she led a research team in identifying the health service needs of young people in Western Australia. In forming a position statement for the Commissioner for Children and Young People and the development of the first WA Youth Health Policy in 2018. And that was a mouthful. But I got now I'll hand over to Pat to share her reflections. She will then hand to Ros, who will hand to Helen, who will then hand back to me for Q&A.
Yeah.
All good, ladies?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for doing that beautiful acknowledgement of country, and thank you for introducing us all. I was thinking, is this boring or not for the audience? But I'm sure they felt not your presentation of it.
No.
Yeah, I was thinking that, but we have been around for some time, so we're a bit the veterans of the area, if you like. And we're going to speak for 10 minutes each. And in my 10 minutes, I plan to, and I will consider the context of when we did this beautiful Working Together book. So most of you have seen it. This actually, the beautiful mauve-coloured one is the second edition. We did the first edition in 2010 and the second edition in 2014. But back in those days, everything was new. Indigenous mental health wasn't really on the table as it is nowadays. Mental health in general wasn't spoken about or researched as much as it is nowadays. So I think we've seen this huge change in the narrative of the priorities of us as a country. I know that when I first graduated as an Indigenous psychologist, that the way forward, I didn't know where my skills and qualifications would fit, because the ways forward for Aboriginal people at that time were very much economically based. But we knew there was a great need, and I think we witnessed some great initiatives that started in the area. We were part of the Burdekin report into mental health services, and a beautiful chapter they did on Indigenous mental health and the needs of our people. We also were very much part of the Ways Forward report by our very good friends, Beverly Raphael and Pat Swan. And that book is still one of the key texts of the areas. And a big consultation had happened, and the first ever Indigenous mental health conference took place to inform that that report ways forward. And that's sort of one of our foundation blocks, if you like, and we've kept that the principles of that in our working together books. But there was very little around. There was very few people writing about the Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. And I think that even when there were very few Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people writing about our own realities, and even though there was goodwill, I think when non-Indigenous people were writing about us, it was much to talk about us as these odd subjects that they were studying out there. And I think terms like decolonisation, Indigenous governance, Indigenous knowledges were different terms that didn't have any mileage back then. So when we started doing the book, and we did the book because there was such a need, people were coming to us for cultural responsiveness, information. We also saw a lot of good work happening out in our communities that people weren't acknowledged about. So I think for us, when we first started doing both the first and the second edition, Indigenous leadership was really important for us, that we needed to be in charge of the whole process. And so that happened. We also took a strength-based position where we promoted and celebrated much of the good Aboriginal programs that were around at the time, and these have increased. But we covered all the area. I think we were very ambitious looking back, and people say, I'll do a third edition. And we go, oh, no, I don't think so. It was hard yakka, and we might talk about what should happen next in any case. It was hard work, but we did it right. We got the experts from all the different areas and all the Indigenous practitioners and Indigenous experts as well. And that was important for us, that this was not going to be just a textbook looking at Aboriginal people as the exotic other, that we were very much engaged in there. Where possible, we've got a section that celebrates all the good programs. And so I think we were part of witnessing a big change in the narrative, a big paradigm change, which we take for granted nowadays. We do take it for granted. But at that time, back in 2010 and 2014, they were rare considerations. So we stood by that, us three editors, and made sure there was good Indigenous governance, good Indigenous representation, good Indigenous authorship. So we know that out of 70 authors in the whole of the text, 44 of those were Indigenous. Where possible, we had Indigenous lead authors. So looking back, we were very busy. We got the book finished. And later on, we've found out, and particularly as we started celebrating, we thought, hey, we should have a celebration of the book. It's been 10 years, and some of it's still relevant. A lot of it's still relevant. But then when we put out messages saying to people, tell us, how did the book impact on you? Was it useful? And people have responded brilliantly. A lot of people have said things like, this is the Bible for me of our area. So I think our efforts have been, were well spent. We will talk about what happens next, but I think that just concludes my little talk. I think just to remind everyone, and more mature people in the audience will remember those times when the whole perception of mental health and the addressing mental health was very different, let alone Indigenous mental health. And now we see all the stats show that more than ever we need more Indigenous mental health professionals, whether they're psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, but we also there's a dire need for cultural responsiveness as well. So we'd flagged that in the book. We also made some, sorry, I was signalled that I was going to finish, but just one more point, guys, one more point. One of the things that I like particularly about the Working Together book too is that some of the paradigms that were presented have really had now got a life of their own. So this is the first time we presented the social emotional wellbeing diagram, which we see everywhere now. But the Indigenous psychologist led that chapter, Dr. Graham G, and they actually met in Brisbane just after the floods and developed that chapter and tested it with Aboriginal audiences to ensure that it was a true reflection of Indigenous realities. And now to see that, and I'm sure there's other models and other ways in the book that have become a force of their own in their own right individually. But that was the first time we ever presented SEWB in the way that it is presented nowadays. But again, that was on the shoulders of other giants like the Ways Forward Report and other Aboriginal committees that had made a commitment to, trying to sort out Indigenous wellbeing. And at that point, I will stop.
Good.
I hand over to Ros. Okay, sorry, Ros.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks very much. Listening to all that you said, it was just really exciting to remember all the energy that went into it. Thank you, Michael, for the acknowledgement to country and also the introduction to all of us. One of the things that we've been talking about in terms of working towards this webinar is, well, how come we went to the second edition? And one of the things that comes to mind is that when we did the first edition, we did really with like $29,000, I think, and we worked with ASA, and we didn't have full control over it.
No.
It actually sat over much more in Canberra and much more with ASA. And one of the things that the feedback coming back from everyone was the really critical need to have, as Pat talked about, Aboriginal leadership, and to really pick up with the issues that we didn't feel had actually been addressed in that first book that we did. And so we went to government with the idea of this has to be really done properly. It has to have Aboriginal steering committee, it has to have Aboriginal authors all the way through. We have to pick up with sections in the book that just weren't addressed at all in the first edition, and to really resource non-Aboriginal people so that they would work differently with Aboriginal people going forward, and to have a different mindset about how they were seeing Aboriginal mental health and social emotional wellbeing. In fact, most people that we spoke with initially, most of the disciplines that we worked with and consulted really were still very much working within a very deficit discourse, and the idea that that there were social and cultural determinants that might have been impacting and really contributing to Aboriginal mental health were just that it just wasn't on the table. And so it became that the impetus for the three of us, I think, as we went on, was this: we've got this chance. We've got this chance to actually reframe things, to start to educate non-Aboriginal people in ways that that they haven't thought of. And so we worked very closely with just a huge range of stakeholders. I was trying to count them up earlier and on my fingers, and I think I ran out at about 29, where I started thinking of all the different agencies and services and disciplines that we sort of consulted with. And so the book we were able to really look at things like cultural competence, which now we prefer not to use the sort of terminology of cultural competence per se, but it's still that chapter in that book, even though I'm an author on it, still has some real relevance today, in that it pushes people to really understand that working in a culturally safe and culturally responsive manner really needs it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey of listening and working with Aboriginal people and really understanding and going back and learning the context and the history and Aboriginal ways of working, Aboriginal knowledges, Aboriginal values, beliefs, and taking those things into account when working across the whole gamut of social and emotional wellbeing and mental health. And really, I think the feedback that we've had from the book over time is that we really got in and sort of captured and nailed some of that.
Yes. And we had some big challenges too, remember, when in the first edition, when they didn't like the term colonisation.
Oh, yes. So that's right. We, in trying to get the first book published, we had a very senior person who was in the funding bodies saying, look, you know, this is really pushing against sensibilities. You know, can we use words like so-called colonisation? Can we take out words like invasion? You know, racism. You've used the word racism. Could we sort of change that and take that out? And we were like, no, I'm really sorry. We just can't. We can't do that. The evidence is here. Everything is here, and there was someone who, with the second book, actually took the book home to do some of the sign off on the book, and got back in touch with us on the Monday and said, look, I took this book home on the weekend, and I was having an argument with it. I was fighting against the chapters. I was really thinking, well, I'm a migrant. I came to this country. I've experienced all these hardships. I've experienced this sort of situation, and I was really pushing against. And then I got to chapter 4, and I got it. I absolutely got it. And I read the whole book, and I went to work on Monday and said, this book has to be compulsory reading for everyone who works in government. And I think for us, that was just something that really, it was one of the things that kicked the book over the line at that stage. And alongside of that, one of the things that made us really, I guess, very proud and sort of feeling that we were on a winner in one way was that it had been to the Chief Medical Officer in the ACT. It had been clinically checked, every chapter that had any clinical significance. And it had also been to the Aboriginal Steering Committee and an Aboriginal group, reference group, and had been the cultural integrity of the book had been checked as well. So they were the two things I think that made us feel that we'd got there. Yeah. And I'd like to hand over now to Helen.
Thank you. Thank you, Ros, and thank you, Michael, for the welcome and the acknowledgement this morning, or today, I should say, probably afternoon for a lot of people over on the East Coast. And it is really nice to be here today thinking and reflecting about this book. And I certainly go with Pat's comments about how much, what a huge gap there was in textbooks, in understanding, in knowledge, even in reference material or articles back then. For me personally, when I was going through my psychiatry training, there was not much to draw from in the literature, and that was back in the sort of 1990s. There were no textbooks. There was very little Indigenous authorship. So when there was the opportunity to work on this textbook with Pat and Ros, I really jumped at the chance because I'd already had to develop an enormous amount of curriculum myself just to fill in some of these gaps. So to be able to collaborate with a whole pile of Indigenous authors and our allies on this book was just a wonderful experience. The process, I actually, to be honest, didn't think I had the qualifications to be an editor, but who else was going to do it? And if we didn't do it, you know, like who else was going to do it? So at the end of the day, we just had to, you know, put our heads down and get on with it, which I think is probably a testament to our resilience coming from a culture that's been so resilient despite all of the things that have happened to us historically. So it was a wonderful experience working with Pat and Ros on this book. It was also a really interesting experience working with all of the other Indigenous authors and our allies through the chapters. Some of it was heavy going, some of it was quite challenging and difficult, and we had some hard conversations during that time, but publishing isn't easy. And I also think that from my experience of having then qualified as a psychiatrist and worked in clinical practice as well as in academia, having your work published is really hard. It's a really hard thing to do. And I think for a lot of our mob back then, they almost felt too scared to put their stuff forward for publication. It wasn't a safe process for our knowledge. Like how could we get our knowledge out there in a safe way? And I think almost accidentally what happened as part of the process of what we did with the Working Together was create a culturally safe place for our authors and our workers and our allies to be able to publish really good Indigenous knowledge in a way that was useful then for the whole sector to move forward. And if we think about it now, we could probably break it down and say what all of the things were. But the fact that we were able to work with our own mob, and that was going to be seen at the editorial panel as working with your own mob, that Indigenous governance was absolutely critical, I think, in making, and I'm not at all downplaying your role, Ross, because you're absolutely amazing as well. Yeah. But I think we needed that Indigenous leadership at that upper level, because prior to that, most books that I'd read, most articles that I'd read, the Indigenous authorship was well down below. There was no Indigenous leadership at the top. And so I think this was a really important thing to have Indigenous editors, because it was probably one of the first textbooks that was like that. Certainly one of the first ones that I've been involved with. So I'm not surprised that it did have that great impact. Just in terms of some of the other things that we included in the chapters, I think there'd been a reasonable amount of information that had been circulating around that time around the well-being of adults and the stolen generation, and these were big topics. But there hadn't been enough emphasis on the social and emotional well-being of children. And certainly as a child psychiatrist, this was one of the areas that I really wanted to push and promote in the book, that you can't just bring in SEWB when you're 15 or when you're 30. It really has to be grounded right in that early period of life, right through pregnancy, even before pregnancy, even thinking about becoming a parent and how we bring our children into the world. And so, I thought it was great that we were able to have across the lifespan in this book, because most textbooks tend to be chopped up into age groups or different particular at-risk groups, whereas this was a holistic book. It covered such a range of topics, but it also covered right across the lifespan, from the early years in pregnancy and in infancy right through to our elders and our old people. So that was a really great process, I think, for me, being able to have that child's voice represented within the book. The other thing that I also wanted to talk about was this whole issue around social and emotional wellbeing from a cultural perspective. Now, we had written the first social and emotional wellbeing framework back in about 2004. Didn't really get implemented. People didn't really understand what it was. Then we were able to, with this textbook, expand that whole knowledge base around what social and emotional wellbeing really is. And I think that then made it much easier for the mental health, I suppose, system to grapple with it and really think about it from an Indigenous perspective. Yeah. And if you think about it like this, if you look at the science of wellbeing, what we've been able to show, which is kind of ironic, I suppose, is that there's actually a science to everything that we did around wellbeing. We just perhaps hadn't put it in that way when we'd written about it previously. But if you look at things like our kinship structures, our ecological framework of embedding people within nature and the relationships with the natural environment, with animals, with the earth, with country, with the cycles of life, the connection to country, the connection to ancestry, spirituality, the way that we developed early autonomy in childhood, that omnipotence of the infant in the early years, as well as the idea of totems and storytelling and all of those things. If you look at all of that, plus things like ceremony, multi-generational living, being out in nature, they all actually improve your wellbeing, and they're all best practice in terms of bringing up children and in understanding child development. So what I can confidently say today is that not only did we get it right historically, but we had this profound knowledge base that has now been shown by Western science in the modern era to be right. Okay. So I think given that, I really want to encourage everybody to look at this understanding of ways of knowing, being, and doing from an Indigenous perspective that promotes the wellbeing not just of adults, but right from the beginning of life and throughout the cycles of life and across the generations, because there's a lot to learn. And I can confidently say that from a cultural and a science perspective, we are absolutely on the right track with this notion. And I think it's actually healthy for everybody to be thinking about how they apply those models to everybody, because at the end of the day, we are the oldest living culture in the world. We survived an ice age and we survived genocide. and we still have an enormous amount of knowledge and expertise to contribute to the wellbeing of our children and our future generations. So I think it was a really amazing process to go through the editing and the writing process of the Working Together book. I think it was a really landmark book in its day and probably still is. I've had an enormous number of people in the mental health system come up and thank us for having, produced the book and that they still use it today. A lot of the principles and practices are still relevant today. And if you think about it from a historical perspective, a lot of those ways of understanding wellbeing back from 10,000 years ago, connection, ancestry, ecological framework, embedding in nature, all of those things, they haven't changed. They still keep us well today. So I'm going to hand back to Michael.
Okay, thank you, ladies, for that. That was fantastic. Really are a credit to yourselves and everyone else. And the work you do is fantastic. I can swear by the book and other processes. It's good. Been fortunate enough to know you. Been involved in this for a long time.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right. So we'll move to the questions. And so please type your questions into the Q&A box. We will direct as many as we have time for the panel. Just remember, we've had some questions submitted ahead of time, so we'll start with those while new questions start coming into the chat. As I said before, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but we are limited by time. Just know that we very much appreciate all your queries and feedback, and all of them will be read and saved down the track.
Yes.
And they could be addressed in future webinars, and they will definitely inform our future work.
Yep.
So the first question is to Ros. Ros, how do you think the discourse around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and wellbeing has changed in the last 10 years?
Okay. Well, both Helen and Pat have touched on this to some degree, and I think, as I said earlier, the discourse had been largely focused around deficit, around blaming, around thinking that many of the issues that Aboriginal people were facing were due to their own, sort of problems and issues, and did not recognise at all the strengths and resilience of Aboriginal people, or to understand that the discourse is kind of framed in a very positivistic, science-based process that did not make way for having other cultural ways of viewing the world, other ways of framing. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is that reframing to have a very strong decolonising perspective, ensuring that Aboriginal voice, Aboriginal knowledges, and, as Helen said, ways of being and doing are really put at the forefront of understanding. And that has a really major impact on then how you interpret, how you do mental health assessment, how you do diagnosis and so on. So I think they're quite major.
Excellent. Thanks for that answer, Ross. And we thank you for giving your time up today. We know you've been a little bit crook of that, but all good. And so, Helen, question 2. Do you have a changed or refreshed perspective on the importance of the book in the wake of the voice referendum? And,
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Have you got all day?
We got a week.
So look, it's interesting, isn't it? The current landscape, and of course the landscape changes. We've just come out of COVID, which was a very traumatic period, I think, for everybody. There was a lot of stress and anxiety and loss during that period, and there was also, I think, a lot of anger and frustration for people as well, as their own sort of personal freedoms were perhaps thwarted during that time. And then immediately after that, we've come out of this very traumatic period. We then go into the referendum and the referendum debate, which was really quite difficult. And I think that what we've seen in the post-referendum landscape is this this change that's occurred, and it's taken us backwards. It's taken us back probably 50 years in some of the way we see relationships and the way we see racism and some of the overt racism that's now being experienced, particularly by some of our children and our young people, that they have to go through that. When you think that really as a country and as a nation, we have to accept history, we have to accept what happened, we can't change that. It is part of what we've been through as a nation. But if we are going to heal and if we are going to move forward, then we need to make that a safe process. And I think that the no voters, it's not just no to a voice, it's no to hundreds of years of colonisation and oppression and other difficulties that we've had. So it was not simple at all. And the impact of us as Aboriginal people has now been to make us feel less welcome in our own country, less confident in our positions. Certainly it's impacted on my colleagues quite significantly, my own family and some of my friends and communities that I work with, in that they don't feel as comfortable anymore. And so I'm not really sure what the way forward is, except to say that we have come a long way. We are now going backwards and we need to turn that around and come forward again. And one of the ways that we can come forward again is to relook at the learnings in this book. How do we privilege an Indigenous voice? How do we understand social and emotional wellbeing and connection in a way that's positive for everyone? At the end of the day, we all want much of the same things. We want to have a good life. We want to have health and prosperity and wellbeing for our children and our future generations. We can't do that in a divided country. We have to be together on this. We have to increase our sense of connection. And I think we can do that by really grappling with this knowledge system that we have about wellbeing and what wellbeing really means. And at the core of wellbeing is connection. And that's what we have to get back to. So I actually think a lot of the learnings in the book are even more relevant and even more critical today if we're going to move forward as a nation and as peoples together.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah. And I know that's a problem subject for all of us, but anyway, that was well said.
I'll just make one more comment before we leave it. No one's talking about the post-referendum landscape at the moment, and I think this is a problem because it's been a massive event. It's left a lot of people feeling lots of strong emotion, and there's not really been much support other than the immediate post-referendum support, which might have been there for a few weeks. But people are still feeling distress. And people are still feeling uncomfortable. So I think we do need to open up the dialogue and the conversation again. We did a webinar a few months back at TKI where we talked about this. And what it did do was it opened up a new pathway to talk again and to feel close again. And I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to be talking and moving forward. So I hope to see more conversations about this coming up soon so that we can start actually progressing again.
No, that's very well said. Yeah. There's a lot we can say about that, but well said. So, Pat, are there any ways of thinking from the book that you think are even more relevant or urgent today?
Well, I was thinking about that question, and I think there's two things that come forward for me. Actually, picking up on the referendum issue is the increased racism or expression of racism. I don't think it's anything new. I think it's always there, but hidden. And I think one of the negative impacts of the failed referendum is that it's enabled racism to express itself freely, where before we wouldn't have accepted, some of our posts on social media and whatnot, some of the comments on it as disgusting. So, we usually block and delete because that's the best way forward. But the racism, and I certainly in the Working Together book, we did have a section on racism, but it was a small section. I think there almost needs to be a whole book written about racism and the different levels of it. You've got systemic racism, cultural racism, direct racism. So all those are at play, and just the ignorance of some people expressing themselves. They're probably only a small group, having said that, or I hope they are. But we're seeing, I think that maybe it's a positive thing that we're seeing racism outed much more. We've seen it in, particularly in the sports arena. It's being outed, so that's a good thing. So I think that at the time when we were writing the book, people thought that racism wasn't an issue, that, you know, we had dealt with it somehow, and we haven't. Yeah, and even those sentiments that have come out since the failed referendum show that it's been there but possibly hidden. And we're seeing more people now naming it up and outing it. So I think that's an important part. We need to have more conversations about racism and how we address it at all the different levels. So number one. Number two, I think the general mental health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and particularly suicide, that has, you know, we knew when we were doing the books that the suicide rates were increasing, and they continue to increase, even in times in the COVID years when the mainstream rates actually stayed the same. Our rates still steadily increase. So I think that this book and other reports like the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander suicide prevention evaluation report that put some really good ways forward, that, you know, communities need to be in charge of their own business, and it's not just one cure. There's a whole you know, a variety of different interventions that are needed, you know, from immediate interventions to building up cultural resilience and strength that are needed. So I think suicide has become a bigger issue, and we do need to really seriously look at how we address that. Having said that, a big change that has happened is Indigenous people in charge of their own suicide prevention activities. So again, everything goes back to that. You know, if it's anything about Indigenous people, they have to be at the table, but, you know, in an empowered way, making decisions, not in a tokenistic way. So I think that whole thing about Indigenous governance, co-design, whatever you call it, is very, very important. And that's probably, you know, one of the big issues that emerged.
If I could just make a comment following on from those comments by you, Pat. My concern about the racism in particular is that the last thing we want is to create another barrier for people to seek help, particularly when we're seeing the rates of distress in young people and children and families, the rates of suicide. As you were saying, Pat, there's this increase in the number of people who are feeling that way. And so I think that if we're going to really use the book effectively, then that issue of cultural safety is even more relevant today, because while there's more barriers because of what's happened post-referendum, we've got to make sure, even doubly sure, that our services are safer for people to be able to seek help.
Yeah. Well said. So sure. I was deep in thought there. So now, a question from a webinaree. To all editors, to all three of us, in Western Australia, the MT, and at a Commonwealth level, we have up and coming elections. What kind of commitments would help to fulfil the vision and principles set out in working together? So in all of it,
I'm going to say something really simple in response to that, and that is that we've seen report after report after report. You only have to go and look at the productivity report to say that we're just not getting there, are we? We've got these wonderful Close the Gap campaigns and initiatives and targets, and yet when the Productivity Commission does their report and looks at the evaluation, we're not getting there. And part of it is because we're still doing business as usual.
Yes.
And this has been reported over and over again. So I think that what we're seeing, where we're seeing gains being made, is with Indigenous governance. Self-determination is a key principle in the way forward to actually improve social emotional wellbeing, health, mental health, whatever you like to look at as an indicator. Self-determination, the ability to govern your communities and your own life and the lives of your children, is a fundamental principle that we have to go in moving forward. So business as usual is not going to work if there's no power and control for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities within Australia. And just thinking about that for a moment, we've seen this play out in other countries where self-determination, again, is a key principle in the success of the programs. So there's no reason why we can't do it. We just have to think differently about it. Now, when we were doing some cultural safety work with some of our healers said to us, a proper partnership means friendship. And what friendship does in a partnership is it means you have to care for each other. So if you're going to care for the people that need you, you have to care for each other first before you can move forward in partnership, because it's built on friendship. I think that is a different way of looking at the relationship. So rather than looking at the relationship in terms of money and power and control, why don't we look at it in terms of kindness and compassion and caring? And maybe then it won't be business as usual, but it'll be better.
Yeah. I'm actually going to let that be the answer, because I think you nailed it.
Oh, as usual. The oracle is back. Sorry, that's our pet word. Ross, do you want to add to that?
Well, I sort of tend to agree with Pat, but we have a little tiny thing to add, just to add to say, I think something like the National Partnership Agreement, which is there and again isn't being taken to its full capacity, the 4 target, the 4 priority reforms, but they would fit very nicely with what Helen is saying. If we took the data sovereignty, the governance and self-determination that's underpinning those priority areas, we would be moving a long way forward. And so there are some answers there. There's jurisdictional plans here in WA. These things need to be taken seriously by government and held accountable. I just think that's essential.
Now you've got me thinking, and I'm going to make a comment.
Go on.
This is interactive.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's too difficult. We've got these government processes and accountability and blah, blah, blah all set up. But we know that, particularly if I name one, in our state, our state sat down with our Aboriginal Health Council of Western Australia, and they committed some money and they sat down and engaged in a co-design process. Now, that's been wonderful. We're yet to see the outcomes, but, we have high expectations of that. And I love holding that up as an example because, there's often lots of reasons why things can't be done. They can be done. And this is a great example of that. So in response to that question from the webinar audience is, I think that if we wanted to see change, I'd say self-determination, definitely, more resources to Aboriginal communities. So we need resources to be flowing into the communities.
Excellent. So now another question from a webinar. To all editors, will there be a third? And if so, when? Now, I'll make a comment. I think Naomi Campbell famously never got out of bed for 10 grand. You've mentioned 30. That's 10 each.
I don't think we got any money out of it. We did this all for free.
As usual.
Yeah. It was a labour.
With a labour of love.
Look,
So will there be?
we have discussed it in part, and we're thinking that, it's still current. So if people don't have a copy, all the hard copies are gone by now. We know that 100,000 copies went out for Edit 1 and Edit 2. Plus, when we were counting them, there were 50,000 downloads. So you can still download it and have it printed. We've actually seen it on eBay for sale too. That's quite bizarre.
Given it was free.
Yeah, it was a free resource. And at the moment, it's housed at Telethon Kids Institute. So if you want a copy, please go there. We will also probably house it at Guy Dewey, Proud Spirit, which is our Aboriginal peak body, and possibly at UWA as well. We're still talking about that. But we have discussed a third edition, and I think personally, I'd say, I don't want to die too young, but because it was a labour of love and it was very intensive. Ros was the main one dealing with all those authors, ensuring that everyone was supported, that we did create space for cultural safety and respect. So it was at the time we did have the seminar and we did it really well. I think that we've discussed possibly having an online version and then building information about particular topics. So There's a whole swag of new research, new perspectives that have come out. So we've been talking about maybe that we have the online version, but we pick out topic areas that are really important and put more energy into that. So they have it more as an online version that we can update as we go along as well. But that's my thoughts. Others might say, no, let's go for Mark 3.
I'm not sure I've got another book in there, to be honest with that. And, you know, I feel like, and no offence to my co-authors, but I feel like we're the old brigade. And I have just seen some fantastic young Indigenous writers coming forward, in the psychologists and the psychiatrists and the doctors and the nurses and the, you know, whatever, all multidisciplinary. And I'd really like to encourage those younger ones coming through now to think about what they could contribute potentially to a third edition or to a whole new textbook or a whole new mental health landscape or whatever. And we've contributed lots of book chapters to other books, but not taken on a whole book ourselves. And I do agree with Pat that some of the chapters are still relevant. The principles really remain the same and they don't change. So perhaps having some bespoke chapters that we could add to the book, particularly if people had particular things that we do need to sort of gather the evidence base for and write about, we could think about that. But I would also encourage all of our young writers out there to start thinking about what's the textbook you want to write in the next few years. And maybe we can help you.
Yes,
Well,
I agree with both of you. I think we've had our opportunity to do this, and this is a really good opportunity going forward for, as Helen says, young, or early career researchers and psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on coming forward, mental health workers to put a new stamp on things and to just keep pushing us non-Aboriginal people to keep thinking about things, because the landscape we thought had changed, but as Helen pointed out before, the post-failed referendum is a time to go back and really think about some of these things, and perhaps that's something to pick up with, going forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob.
Right. Yep, no, that was excellent, Ron. So I'm not too sure, I didn't ask this one, I think. So to all editors, where do we go from here? Do you have any thoughts? You kind of have, or messages for upcoming groups of researchers, which is great, writers, academics, or health professionals, because I've always had a conversation, you two here, Helen and Pat, not really with Roz, but always talked about succession plans.
Yeah.
Not that that's your responsibility, but we hope someone jumps out of the pack, or a group of them jumps out.
I think there will be.
Well, it has to be a group.
Yeah, there will be individuals and groups. Because the landscapes, when we were doing the Working Together books, we had our good Indigenous researchers and community practitioners. Now that's changed. I'm seeing so many more people go to higher education or they're Indigenous. You don't have to go to university. They might have good, a wealth of Indigenous knowledge that now is being recognised when it wasn't before. So I think that the progression will happen. But do we have 7 minutes left?
Oh, keep going.
Okay. But look, this is our celebration of our 10th year anniversary. This webinar is only a part of that. We're actually going to do a lot more things. I know that there's a webinar planned to discuss the social emotional wellbeing chapter, and we'll have Dr. Graham G, Dr. Clinton Schultz and others presenting. So we've got some fabulous webinars forthcoming, and there'll be lots of information posted. So this isn't a one-off. It's actually the first of a series of activities that we'll be doing. So watch this space, everyone.
The other thing I'd like to add about the way forward is that more and more in my own work, I've tried to make sure that we privilege the way that we think before we start doing work. So, for example, we've got a beautiful painting on the front of the Working Together book. And what that painting has is it's a conceptualization from an Aboriginal perspective that has a narrative to it. And so it's a beautiful picture, and you should read the story about that inside the book. And what we tend to do with a lot of Indigenous artwork is it's just used for decoration, whereas in actual fact, the artwork itself is knowledge. Okay, and what I'd really like to see is a lot more of these ways that we had of understanding, of conceptualizations, of the narrative, of the artwork being embedded in the way we do research, the way we develop frameworks. So rather than doing a reconciliation action plan with a beautiful picture on the front, that picture actually forms the framework. And that's then embedded in everything that we do. That's when we'll get to the real point of embedding social and emotional wellbeing and cultural understandings into the way we see the problem, the way we see the solutions and the outcomes that we achieve. And when we do that, and when I've done this with our mobs and our healers and our, particularly around mental health, it's been such a richer experience. And I've learned so much more than if I'd done traditional methodologies using Likert scales or whatever else you might use. When you do it from a cultural perspective, embedded within narrative, image and conceptualizations, it's so much richer. And I think that's what we should be pushing for going forward.
No, excellent. Very well said. And look, when you do put it into practice, not blowing our own trumpet here, but I will. So when we did the Specialist Aboriginal Mental Health Service, we had a model of care that was caring for the person focused, and we never had a suicide of an active client in our 12 years.
Yeah.
Now, when we all left the building, sadly what happened, we had a couple of suicides. So it does work.
It does work.
And it is relevant. So now,
Over to Rod.
yeah. Yep. That's what it was.
I have a question.
Have you got an answer?
I got an answer.
Yes, mate.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about that's special in the book is the number of Aboriginal-led programs.
Yeah.
And they're just amazing. And when you're talking about the healing and the healers, you know, these, again, when we talk about the notaries in the book, these government policy people and funders were like, well, you know, what's the evidence here? What's going on? And then similarly, when we had a whole section sort of looking at things like red dust healing, well, where's your sort of randomised control trials and where's the evidence? But it was just oozing out of everything. And the testimony to how important all those Aboriginal-led programs are is in the stories that are sitting in that book, and they still hold, you know, right now, today. So.
Thank you for that, Ross. So, I'm going to kind of wind up.
Okay.
That was excellent. Thank you, ladies, for coming in. I love that. Is it a shawl or what?
Scarf.
Scarf?
It's actually a turtle.
That's not the same one you had on in the photo?
No.
I keep going back to the photo. That's not reliable at all. So thank you for coming to the webinar today. And look, thanks for everyone who, I don't know what the word is, signed on, or what do they do? Log on.
Yeah, attending.
All those that attended. And we will utilise your information and feedback. And thank you for 550 odd people.
And if you've got any ideas for new chapters, let us know.
Yeah.
What a great idea.
And also, we don't mind a bit of constructive feedback, as long as it's not too destructive.
Yeah.
But anyway, so thank you for coming to the webinar today, and a very big thank you to the editors, Roz, Pat and Helen. Roz, you have to sign my book there. We appreciate their fantastic work and dedication very much. You can download the Working Together book for free on the TKI, Telethon Kids Institute website, and you can follow us at Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing and the Centre for Best Practice in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention on social media. I think that's you, Pat, eh?
That is.
Oh, yeah, that's your baby. We will share the recording from today's event along with the slides and relevant links to everyone who registered. You can contact Ainsley Walker at uwa.edu.au if you have any follow-up questions about the event, or if you would like to request one of the few remaining physical copies of the book. They're as rare as hen's teeth. Apparently there was one on YouTube. Not YouTube,
eBay.
eBay. We don't know who bought that, but we'll try this one. So thank you very much, Ainsley. That was excellent. And to Navid, our IT guy. There will be more webinars and activities celebrating this important anniversary to follow, so watch this space. And thank you to our two wonderful supporters that came along on our hearing. So thank you very much, and we'll sign. Ladies can say see you. And
Yeah. Thanks,
you.
Michael.
Thanks,
Thank
Michael.
you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Bye.